I'd like to pick up a couple of thoughts here this morning as we continue our study, a lesson series on what can happen when we find ourselves or a loved one emotionally wounded. And maybe a little bit of qualification in that arena has to be made as we think about what that might be, what it might look like. There are things that can happen in a person's life, whether in the past, present, or what may happen later on, that can have a serious effect on our emotional constitution and have the potential of reverberating almost like an echo in a canyon again and again and again over the course of time. And in some cases, for some folks, that kind of emotional wounding can have a couple of specific results. When it drifts into or tends toward a clinical diagnosis, it can manifest itself as a kind of depression, a very serious kind, as well as deep and disconcerting feelings of anxiety that present sometimes as panic attacks or inability to function in so-called normal ways, appropriate ways on a day-to-day basis. And some of the things that we have discussed so far have to do with various of the what I'll call this morning myths or misconceptions about what someone who suffers like this ought to be able to do about their situation. One of those, as we move forward in the discussion, one of those myths or misconceptions is that people with depression or anxiety ought to just snap out of it. And that perhaps has been a statement or a phrase you've heard, God forbid, perhaps even thought, or maybe even said out loud. Some of us with fewer filters might be guilty of that out loud demonstration. And all things being equal, if someone is feeling a little blue or having just a little bit of an anxious thought or feeling, well, under maybe, quote, normal situation or normal circumstances, a statement like that could be appropriate. You know, cheer up. Cheer up. We say that, and that can be helpful to some people if it's accompanied by a hug or a handshake or a pat on the back or maybe even some assistance through the difficulty. But in those cases where someone finds themselves in an illness cycle with a perhaps even clinical diagnosis, to say such is foolishness. It would be like saying to someone suffering with tuberculosis, oh, just stretch and breathe deep, you'll be fine. You know, snap out of it. Well, that is nonsensical, and we know it's obviously impossible. And so there's a presumption here that depression or anxiety, the kind that we're talking about here this morning, is an item of choice. That they woke up one morning and said, you know, I think I'm just going to bury myself in the deepest, darkest depression, and guess what? I'm going to top it off like a cherry with a panic attack. How's that sound, you know? That we just got up in the morning and decided to do that. There are many causes to this emotional wounding that we're talking about that has often the result of depression and anxiety from a clinical standpoint. One of those causes of emotional wounding is nature. What do I mean by that? Well, your natural makeup as a human being. For example, you have a unique body chemistry. And there are some people who inherit a kind of biology that might make them susceptible to emotional problems. Now, these are observations that have been made by researchers and clinicians, people who know somewhat about the subject. Maybe at a high level, we would understand it very clearly if we thought about the effect that adrenaline has on a human being, specifically the male of the species. When a man gets agitated, aggravated, or otherwise scared, he gets a shot of adrenaline. And it's that shot of adrenaline that affects his behavior in remarkable ways. I mean, probably the most classic example is one that I mentioned of my grandfather many, many years ago, who could barely walk, but when he backed his car over my mother when she was like 7 years old, he heard her scream, stopped the car, got out of the vehicle, and realized that it was still on top of her. He actually lifted the car enough to pull her out. That's a story that's told, almost as a legend in our family of how he pulled her out of that car, out from under that car. And that's the effect of adrenaline on the human physiology. I know that's a one-time kind of thing, but can you imagine if someone were affected, and I'm going to be supercilious here, a little bit exaggerating, if someone had that particular chemical or compound in their body raging at all times, just constant adrenaline presence. That would be the Hulk. Yeah, the Incredible Hulk. That would be abnormal, wouldn't it? We would say that would probably be unusual, yes. There are much more subtle compounds that present in the body have the power to affect the body over long-term and in chronic conditions in adverse ways. And while adrenaline can be a good thing on a periodic basis, instantaneous basis, it's what causes a 25-year-old man to storm the gates and attack an enemy and to be victorious and achieve the Medal of Honor status. It's also the kind of thing, of course, that can push him off a cliff or cause him to do something completely irrational. And in any case, those compounds, many different kinds, present in many different concentrations in the individual biology of a person, can and sometimes do get out of balance. Now, in the case of a male, you see the adrenaline issue. To be at the risk indelicate, there is the circumstance that exists for women on a periodic basis. That sometimes affects their mood, how they feel, the way their body works. We recognize those two things, adrenaline and the monthly cycle that females go through, as a normal process. But it's a natural process. And those kinds of things can have a consequence in your temperament. Those two things, as I mentioned a moment ago, are normal and natural and expected. But some of the things that take place in a person's body, heart, or mind, in their biological makeup, can have as well symptoms that are persistent and alarming. Some of this, I think, we inherit. Some of this maybe can be passed from generation to generation through that biology that we have. Maybe those of us with kids can attest to that fact. You got a child, you say, wow, that kid's just like her grandma, just like her grandpa. You can see some of that. There are other temperaments that I think we recognize as being, part of the process. You say, here's one child that's particularly sensitive. I mentioned a week or so ago the differences in daughters. I got one daughter that if she was, in trouble and you looked at her crossways and just said, I'm disappointed in you, she would just dissolve in tears. The other one would laugh in your face and want to poke you in the nose. Difference in kids. And it's a difference in biology to some extent. And that's maybe the effect of nature on someone's maybe tendency toward depression or anxiety. Now, maybe I'd pause at this moment. Is there any comment or question about that, or any assent and say, yeah, I agree, or no, I don't think so? I'll just give you a minute. You see the possibility that nature could predispose some people to emotional difficulty?
I think that science has already proven that.
Okay.
We see that in patterns of body chemistry, but also patterns of behavior too. So there's a biological component to behavior as far as how a person chooses or their thought process in choosing, how they respond to a stimulus or something like that. So there's science on both sides of that.
Sure. I can't help but think about one that I think is fairly well established, and that is the fight or flight response.
Or freeze.
Or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. I hadn't thought about freeze, but that's true. There you go. Nature. Well, hard on the heels of the nature idea is the nurture concept. One is biology, the other is experience. An experience, a person's life experience, or experience of life, has a strong bearing on the subject. The way you were raised can have a bearing on how you deal going forward. For example, if you're taught to suppress your feelings, big boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Or if you're taught to hold back and not express, well, that can, according to some of the research, lead to a tendency toward depression and even anxiety disorders. And those are the kind of things that I think we can observe, even in ourselves or others. We can see some of that. You see how someone responds, perhaps at work. There's a situation that comes up, and it maybe will be a cause for someone to get angry or otherwise agitated. And how do they express that? At times when they just, blow up, well, that's going to get you fired. The other extreme, though, is to stuff that to the point where you just ball up and hold it in, and you're not gonna express anything there. And of course, that can be damaging too. If I were to ask you on this range of expression where you might be in terms of this idea of suppressing feelings, are you way over here toward I'm going to just stuff it and not express, or are you on the other side where you just totally let it out and just, maybe knowing a little about yourself in that regard might help you to understand maybe some of the ways you're feeling right now. You say, well, I just am a little bit blue. Well, what's bothering you? There might be something you need to express that you haven't expressed. Maybe there's something that is suppressed feelings. Those kind of things, though, that we suppress can be in the present. It might be just as common or as current as yesterday. There was a tense moment with a loved one. And so now there's a bit of a silent treatment happen, and we'll do this for a couple of days, and then it'll work itself out and we'll be all right. That happened a couple of days ago, maybe. And you've been suppressing over that. There may have been something that happened 10 years or 20 years ago. May have been something that happened in your experience you had as a youth, as a child, that is suppressed. And this is where it gets really delicate, very difficult, and I am not qualified to help with some of that. I can give you advice from scriptures and stuff, but in the case where there's something in the past that maybe suppressed your emotions and feelings about, there was a wounding there that took place, hey, it's entirely appropriate and acceptable for you to find someone to discuss that with and pursue that just a little bit. Should you feel that it has an adverse effect on your life, or someone notices an adverse effect on your life and comments, You know, if you feel like you're just a little too depressed too often, a little too anxious too often, what's the cause of that? Because it can be nature. It also can be nurture or lack of nurture, if you get my drift. Someone have a question, a comment? Thought you raised your, oh, you were waving. Oh, okay. I thought you raised your hand. So the way you were raised, maybe you were taught to suppress your feelings. That can often lead to depression and anxiety and disorders associated with that. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Yeah.
To add to what you're saying too is that it's important to realize that in the developmental years of childhood, if you don't get the nurturing from your parents that children need, as far as an education on how to appropriately respond or how to express emotion or even what the emotions are. If you don't receive that education as a child, then you have the potential to be emotionally stunted in your development.
Mm-hmm.
So growing into adolescence and into adulthood, you may not have the competencies that the nature, the environment would provide a typically developing child.
Okay. That can be a case, and I think honestly, lots of work's been done in that arena. I have a picture in my mind that I remember coming out of a National Geographic magazine, and there was a lot of money spent on a study where they were raising rhesus monkeys, okay, and they would take that monkey away from the monkey's mother at an early age, and then present it with, instead of a warm motherly figure, a wire frame with a monkey-like face wrapped with a towel. And as uninviting as that was, the study showed that they would seek that comfort in the absence of any comfort just because it was even an approximation of it. Having that comfort. When Joshua, my oldest, came to live with us, he was 6 months old. He weighed 7 pounds. He'd been neglected and nearly starved to death when he went to the hospital. And he was in the hospital for quite some time. The nurses as well as the doctors began to realize that he was not really going to thrive in that environment. He wasn't possibly even going to survive in that environment. Of course, I didn't know that at the time, and neither did my wife, but we were in Colorado at a special church event, and we got a call. Would we be interested, or would we be able to take a foster child, and when could we be available to do so? So put Kathy on the train and sent her back to Iowa, and she took the child, Joshua. I showed up, and my first thought, frankly, when I looked into the crib and saw that little kid, I said to myself, they've sent this child home to our home to die. That's what I thought. And what's remarkable about that, though, is that my wife had the presence of mind and the instinct, because of her experience and nurture, to understand that what that baby needed was not simply or only, the necessities of food and water. He needed skin. What I mean by that is that her habit was to, anytime she held him, was to get him in contact with her body in some, and again, at the risk of being indelicate, I believe that one thing is what saved his life. Because of the bonding that took place, because of the nurture that was present there, and his experience of that, and of course over the course of the years that we had him, ensured his survival. So, nurture, experience. Now, your experience of life may have been more prickly than that. Or there may have been periods of time. It may have not been that way all the time, but there may have been periods of time when it was difficult for whatever reason. and it'll have an effect on you. Let's cast our minds back to the Depression era, okay? Think about it if you were a child growing up in Depression USA. Rationing is on, and in order to get, various necessities of life, you had to have stamps, special coupons, if you could even get the stuff. And many times you couldn't get the. If you were living on a farm, maybe you had a better chance at some of that. But if you were in cities, you went without to a great degree. You learned to do without, didn't you? Now grow that child up who went through that experience, and while there are fewer of them in our experience right now than there used to be, do you know anyone who's a depression baby or a depression youth? What do you know about them?
They're frugal. Yeah. I would say my grandmother was a depression baby, and she was a hoarder.
Uh-huh. And maybe you begin now to get a little bit of an insight as to what experience of life, how it can affect the reality of life at the present. Yeah.
Obviously, not a depression case, but I noticed with Gia's grandparents, and even when I was in China, every older generation, they go around taking whatever they can find, whether they need it or not, or they'll recycle out of just a hobby, just because every little penny cent counts,
Yeah.
They had to put, in Beijing, they had to put face scanners for the toilet paper dispensers.
Oh my.
Because the old people would go there and take it all.
Oh my. Take all the toilet paper. Yeah.
So just save it, just in case.
Just in case. I get that. Yeah, so there's nurture. I think we connect to it. We understand about it. That's the way you were raised. What we're talking about now is external stress. If there's an external stress that comes upon someone, it might be losing a loved one, in a tragic circumstance, death of a